Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the June edition of the AgilQuest Workplace Leaders Series. We've got a very special treat today in that we have Dave Lathrop from the Steelcase, Inc. He's the Director of Research and Strategy. He's speaking with us today on why bother with buildings, a new perspective on the organizational change. Dave's been with Steelcase since 1984, and he's responsible for developing a cross-disciplinary point of view on the future of work, workers, and workplaces. Early on at Steelcase, Dave helped to develop and implement work and behavioral performance diagnostic tools and capabilities. He now leads advanced field-based research and consulting, where he works with Steelcase clients, consultants, and architectural firms to create sites for user-based place research and implementation, focusing on the issues and principles and the measures of space as an organizational change tool. As an expert on future trends in the office, Dave has been a featured speaker at national conferences such as AIA, IFMA, ULI, the Conference Board, the International Society of Facility Executives, and many more. He's also been published in the Harvard Business Review, the Design Management Journal, to mention just a few. It's a real privilege to have Dave as our speaker today. He's got a truly thought-provoking vision for us, and he's agreed to save some time at the end for your questions. So when you do have questions during the presentation today, please remember to use the WebEx Q&A facility that's part of your desktop. If you queue up your questions at the end of his presentation, Dave will take your questions, and we'll spend as much time as we can before 2 o'clock. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dave Lathrop and the Why Bother with Buildings presentation. Dave?
Thanks, Doug, and welcome to all of you from scenic Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's a beautiful day here. I hope it's beautiful wherever you find yourselves. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of AgilQuest and Steelcase. My background, just by way of introduction, is in organizational development and psychology, and I'm part of a group here that looks at the future of the work experience. And I thought we would start there and talk a little bit about the sort of why of buildings from the point of view of workplace research. We have a fairly long history on this and a strong belief that the best way to learn is to learn through your own experiences. So while we are believers in survey methodologies and whatnot, and certainly have and use those, we really are a boots on the ground kind of a group. We try to find where the edge of the future is expressing itself in the present and go there to learn together. This can create all sorts of interesting opportunities to see forward. And of course, as Jay Doblin once said, I think Jay, for those of you who don't know, is the father of industrial design, that when you're in a situation where things are changing quickly and when there's a great deal of uncertainty, the first thing you want to do is try to organize a little bit what it is that you're beginning to see. And so in that context, it's important for us to think about the why we have buildings question from the point of view of where we stand today. My experience has been in the last, say, dozen years that increasingly organizations think of buildings in different ways than they used to. In the past, it would have been quite normal to think about buildings as being about where you fit in the organizational hierarchy. And recently we have found, as work has evolved, that that's changed radically, and we find clients addressing the need for buildings in very different ways, oftentimes thinking of them as a necessary evil because there is a cost attached. And with this mentality, we tend to approach the stock of real estate from the point of view of how do we make it less bad, the sort of necessary evil model. So our research focus in trying to understand this question about the purpose of buildings begins with the human-centered sort of activities and relationships that drive what work actually is. And as I said earlier, we look at this from a social science point of view, bringing the techniques and methods not only from the traditional social sciences, but also from design research and economics to bear. Our belief is that the lens with which we might look at the intersection of those two and hence sort of define the value of insight that we might be able to offer, that this lens has the character of being social, spatial, and informational. So what does that mean, really? Well, the great bulk of what we think of as office work really is informational in nature. It always has been. But it's the subtle manipulation of information more than the batch process manipulation of information that defines the contemporary work environment. And we'll talk more about that. Because of the amount of information that's available to organizations, it turns out that this process of sorting that information to find the nuggets of value, or said a little differently, to search through the data to find the facts and to search through the facts for the elements of the business case, or the proof statement, if you will, is really the game. And so this informational piece, while always present, is radically altering as we move from routine process work towards what would be more typically cognitive, social, creative kinds of work activities. These are, of course, largely social, and they occur in two kinds of spaces. One is the physical buildings that we know today, and these may be coffee shops, airport lounges, office buildings, our homes, and they also occur in the virtual world. And so we bring these together and look at the interplay between the digital world and the physical world and ask the question about how those two support the social exchange of information. My personal belief in this is that we have underplayed in the last decade fairly radically the potential power of space to facilitate these kinds of social informational exchanges. And one of my sort of beliefs is that if we thought more about our office buildings like we think about our homes, which, by the way, are created within the boundaries of financial and geographic constraint, much like office buildings are, we would solve the problem in a more creative way. We know that our homes are about who we are and what we do, and our offices are like this too, but the boundary is just, the financial boundary rather, is just one element of how we decide where we're going to live. We don't think of our offices that way. As I said, we tend to think of them in a static way, as though not much has really evolved in the last 30 years. It's stunning to me how frequently I still run into situations with clients where the question is, how do we get people to move from offices to cubes, or what's the optimal size of a workspace per person for a cube, or something like this. And really, I would argue these are the wrong questions. That the real questions is why we have the building at all, and back up from there towards the activities that people do, and that's where we'll find the correct answer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along today. I believe that Winston Churchill offered this at the end of the war when Parliament had been firebombed by a V2 strike, and his reference actually was during the rebuilding process, and he was talking to a group of MPs as the Prime Minister and raising the question about how to rebuild Parliament. And his premise was that the cloaking room where the MPs would put on their robes prior to going in, which was grossly undersized for the size that Parliament had grown to, was actually causing a positive function, and that they should not improve that place, that they should simply rebuild it as it was, not only as a cultural icon of how the country had evolved and how this work of running it had emerged and evolved, but also because it brought people into very close physical proximity. It was nearly impossible to put on one's garb without bumping into another person, literally, physically. And he felt that that was central to this and said this at that time, and I think it's something that bears out. So how is it we got here? How is it we got to this sort of cultural resonance of places and buildings? What do we know about our own evolution? And as a way of talking about that, I thought it might be kind of fun to just look backwards and see what we can see in the trajectory. What do we know about the way we've thought about how place has been used and how it's evolved? And so if we go back 10,000 years, and we can make this happen fairly quickly, we could easily conclude that, as Maslow would have told us, that shelter is absolutely sort of the basic thing. Unless you have food and water and shelter, you can't endure physically. Therefore, we have to tend to that, and we did. Along the way someplace, we came to realize that as more and more people populated, as animals began to take or continued to take their toll on our species, that some shelter would be appropriate. And back in the day, of course, 10,000 years ago, that meant physical shelter. Today, it tends to take the form of a financial investment as well as physical, at least in the developing world. There was also this overarching notion of symbology, and space has always served this purpose, Whether it's the Grecian temple reference here or the corporation where the management team sits in larger spaces because of their importance. This is viewed as a reward, and they sit at the top because that seems to make sense in terms of the pyramidic sort of model of our organizations. So the symbolic nature of all this, organizationally, at the level of communities, at the level of architecture as art, etc., all expresses forward in ways that we continue to feel today. But most importantly, all of the purpose of place revolves around this social context, the connectedness of people to each other and what that means, and how we've used place over a long, long period of time, I believe is really governed by these four principles. So you could make the case, and I'll make it here, that somewhere in the early to mid-1800s, developing on through 1900, this basic model, up until this point, this basic model stayed static. We basically had organizations of all types using space in ways that were mostly reflective of these old things. So if you will, for the first 9,850 years of our little model, these were the governing constraints. What happened about that time, as we sort of invented the industrial era, we realized that the structure that we had brought to big business organizations, which we basically inherited, of course, from the church, the Catholic Church largely, and government, to some extent the military. You know, in essence, there's one general, a lot of privates, one pope, a lot of Catholics. That idea, this hierarchical who reports to whom structure that built the industrial organization at the hands of these guys that we have on the left here. This model was co-developing at precisely the same time that the technology and tools of buildings and equipment were evolving too. In other words, up until this point, we didn't really know how to build very tall buildings without making them incredibly massive at the base. And so as our technologies for that improved, in parallel with our communication technologies, we came to adopt the sort of model of using our buildings to represent our processes, to represent our status and hierarchy, to represent and fit with the technologies that gradually evolved from the telegraph and on through today to the internet. But these building technologies, as well as these electronic technologies, as well as these organizational technologies, if you will, were deeply nested together, and we hold these things pretty powerfully in our shared cultural experience. Arguably, this played out reasonably well for the next 100 years, which got us more or less to 1959, and we began to think about it, obviously, in the period following World War II, about a shift in work from the blue collar to the white collar, a phenomena that we're all well familiar with, certainly. And this was complemented in 1959 specifically by two distinct things that happened. The first is that Peter Drucker, the great management sage, coined the phrase knowledge work. And the second was that Bob Noyce, out in California, received a patent for the integrated circuit. These two things, both happening in 1959, arguably defined the beginning of the next era. So if we said that the industrial era is the era that birthed our approach to organizational design, our thinking about what roles and rank mean, it was really around 1959 that began to be possible to think of it differently. And up until that time, white-collar work largely meant the organization man. What changed it Prior to that, too, the invention of other technologies, as we described a second ago, had also changed things equally. And it's odd that it changed them roughly at 50-year intervals. So if we go back to 1859, which was the laying of the first transatlantic cable, or 50 years after that to Marconi when he received his Nobel Prize for the invention of wireless, to 1959, we can see the impact of technology, and it was that thread of growing and changing technology that kind of made the possibility of the knowledge work economy and eventually the distribution of that work away from the office place itself and out onto, as we came to know it in the 80s, the road warrior sort of model, where people could, in fact, be effective and deliver a fair amount of value when they were gone from the office. And we began to see this sort of evolution of portability of information, portability of work, which began to follow portability of capital as the global economy unfolded, and we saw knowledge through its informational aspect and knowledge work through its human aspect flow across the planet. Today, we're at a point where I think it's pretty clear that the sort of left brain arguments about knowledge work are laid to bed. We know that this is the way organizations create value. And now, in the most recent thinking, theorists are beginning to address this next idea of how we bring the principles of design thinking, as Roger Martin would talk about it. Roger is the dean of the business school at the University of Toronto, one of the best global business schools. He talks about design thinking at the same sort of left brain that Drucker would have thought about knowledge work, and it's complemented by a whole range of much more sort of right brain thinkers, including Tim Brown, for example, at IDEO, thinking about this same principle of how we bring the left and right brain together to facilitate faster invention of new approaches, which we would call innovation. Now, along with all of this, we've also seen, as we well know, the parallel shifting of the human preparation and the human demographic that lays underneath all of this work. The reason I wanted to highlight this just for a minute is that our organizations have a bit of a hangover right now, as they always do. Social institutions always evolve at a much slower pace than does technologic innovation. It's just the nature of things. But this idea that the generation which is now largely in retirement, the generation that fought World War II and invented the organizational model that we know today, post-World War II, is that they're still present in the context of this sort of trajectory of organization that we still have. In other words, we still assume today that many of the things about the industrial era organization remain true. The boomers have begun to retire. We know this as well. The first boomer retired last year. And we also know that the millennials are largely into the workforce today. Now, in the natural order of things, something that tends to happen is that with time in employment, people accumulate both control and the ability to influence financial decisions. And so what we see today is the boomers who are now moving into retirement, having assumed or inhaled the generation of thinking that came along with all that we knew about organization for the last 150 years, and now are confronted by an equally large group of people whose preparation and proclivities and attitudes and needs, the millennials, are radically different. They literally work differently. In fact, if I could leave this esteemed group with one overarching comment today, I would say make certain as you approach doing building projects that we give disproportionate weight to the persons for whom the building will have the greatest impact over time. And that's not the people typically who make the rules or who have the money. It's the people who are coming in. Let's not forget, of course, the generations continue to come. There's another whole generation beginning in the year 1999. So many of these people are today advancing into high school, which means we'll begin to see them in just a few years. It's frequently called Generation Z, not out of any great creativity, but because it was the next letter. We don't know really a huge amount about how these people will work yet. However, I would say if you look backwards over time, one of the overarching principles is that people work as they learned how to learn. And so if we look at the educational preparation of a group of people, we can predict with some accuracy how they'll work later. And if we do that, what we find is that the Generation Z kids, as I said, who are all still in school, are actually working in even more team-based, connected, and distributed ways than even the millennials. Technology also is not staying still. Technology, I apologize, is advancing as well, and we'll see that continue, as we all know. Where are we then in all of this? So if we were to stand back for a second and sort of say, we used to play the game of organizational life through structure and power, and that is the presumption of the industrial age organization that we laid out. There are some challenges to it, as we already defined, and this power was reflected in who you knew and where you lived in your building. And so we tended to design buildings around status and rank. We tended to design buildings around processes and efficiency. And this idea is really the root of, in fact, what is currently in change. If we think about it this way, it's natural to ask the wrong questions. And I think that is still where we are. And we might remember at this point the idea that the dominant design of everything always changes over time. The way we think about home, the way we think about family, the way we think about social relationships. These things always have threads based in the trajectory of the past, but they also all evolve. And so we'd have to ask the question about the relevance of status in the contemporary and future organization. Is that still what we want to organize around? Is it hierarchy that matters, or is it something else? Is it maybe who you know? And so we find that it's, as we deal with the complexity that the information age is bringing. By the way, I was at MIT a couple of weeks ago, and one of the profs there was saying that their best guess today is that the current amount of information that's held by our society doubles about every 2 years. Some people say a little less than that, more like 1.2 years. This is a very confounding thing for organizations who would like to create structural solutions. Instead, what we find out is this abundant information really suggests the design of an organization that's much more about social networks, where collaboration is intuitive and based on relationships and intellectual exchange more than it is on routine process assumptions. This then, of course, brings us back to Churchill and the question of why we have the building. Because if in fact, everything has changed and continues to change, why are we still thinking about shaping our buildings in the same way? And what might we know about how to bother with rethinking the design of our spaces? So if we said that the traditional approach of structure and hierarchical was giving way to something which was more global, something more about the unique cultures of organizations, about the relationships of people over distance, about different kinds of activities that are more about trust building and relational things so that the free flow of ideas can happen, what would we design intentionally, and what do we know about that? So I'd say that a couple of things from an implications point of view before I kind of shift gears over to what might we recommend out of this. Our research is highly centered on humans. We base everything on the sort of presumption that it's humans who create value. And it's our belief that the activities that those people are doing today are radically enough different that we ought to think about, at minimum, the way we design our buildings. In fact, if you have the freedom to do your work as you need to do it, facilitated by technologic advances that were are almost unimaginable even 10 or 15 years ago, it suggests that maybe the reason we come together in buildings is to be together as people, and that we maybe have this I and we balance out of sync, and that perhaps the reason people will choose to come in is about something new. This then suggests that the way we have designed our organizational spaces may be wrong. So if I take this very straightforward model of I and we and owned and shared, clearly the way we've historically defined things is like this, that I have a place that I go, it's my office, it's my cube, it's assigned by rank, it's where I fit in, and then we have some shared common areas that maybe we call the break room or a conference room or the cafeteria downstairs or something like that. And this was kind of the set of choices that were available. As we stand back and watch, what we see is the energy of both of these is moving in the direction of these arrows, and we're inventing a whole new set of spaces that actually are becoming more and more common than the traditional spaces. So it's not that any of these are good or bad. It's not that any of these are right or wrong. It's just as we stand back and look, this is sort of the patterning. So we're seeing this idea of groups owning spaces and people sharing individual spaces as an element of this new design. But there's even more to it than that. If we place the campus at the middle of this, or the building, the office of an organization at the middle, we have to acknowledge that people are working, of course, out in the community in all sorts of ways. And the more control we give them over how they work and the more expectation we put on them to be agile and invent new ideas, the less the work is about just cranking through the routine and more about inventing something new. We give them control, and we expect them to be able to exercise that control and work out in the community. Work at home if you need to. Work at that Starbucks down the hall. In fact, people are being allowed to work anywhere. And as we stand back one notch further from that, this idea that the virtual world is actually a workplace as much as the physical world is a workplace compounds this discussion even more. This is without even going to the idea of online gaming and some of those things that are suggesting that for generations coming still, that we'll see the interactive dimensions of working online, not just being about exchanging content information, either through video or through text messaging or whatever, but about literally inhabiting possibly virtual worlds where some of this work can happen. Now, we're not expecting that to happen overnight, but I would simply say this, that most of us have created an avatar at one point or another. If you've ever played on a Wii, you have created an avatar. It's a little tennis player that's sitting in that server someplace waiting for you to come back and play again. And this idea that work can only happen in certain ways that we already understand has always been rudely interrupted from the telephone forward by people working in different ways that connect them together in different ways. So the universal thirst is to focus and think and in parallel to collaborate and create together. These two things are enduring. How we do it, in fact, I'd be the last one to predict that we've seen the end of the fundamental changes. In fact, if you step back for a second, Sun Microsystems, the last building they built just prior to their acquisition by Oracle, I believe it was a virtual building where Sun employees could come from all over the planet. You've probably experimented with some of these yourself. There's actually a tremendous amount of value when a team can come together and post and share information in a virtual space. So we'll see how that evolves. My suspicion is that it's going to continue to move forward. In any case, the notion of all of this is about building strong social relationships between people, because that is at the core of how people work together in complex ways. If we paid serious attention to solving for the organization on the right versus organizing for the people on the left and acknowledge that that work is fluid and can happen, we might be able to come to some conclusions. And so what I thought I would do in close to this today is summarize the 3 lessons I believe we've learned, a fundamental approach, and then 6 principles. And we'll go through this fairly quickly. The 3 principles of how to engage an organization, yours or anyone's, in this question of change is, at first, that you want to optimize at the level of the system. In other words, the why of buildings is not just about being a better tool. It's about supporting the social system that links the business together with its tools. The tool system is technologic, remember, or virtual and physical, and the way those tools play to support the social system is the new focus. We need to understand that. The second thing is that the past is about telling these people what they get and when they have to be where. The idea that we're going to be at the office at 8 o'clock on Monday morning because that's what you do when you go to work, that's still present. I'm not diminishing it. It's just that it's evolving, and it's going to continue to evolve as the talent wars continue. We'll find it less and less appropriate to insist on that kind of a model. This idea then suggests that we give people greater control, which we've been talking about all through this, and that suggests, I think, in this wonderful image, remembering that oftentimes people feel as though they're the children at the Thanksgiving dinner when we think about our new corporate facilities, and they're left over at the side. Maybe they're touched by a survey, perhaps their boss got interviewed, but maybe they didn't really have much of a voice. And our people are far more valuable than that. They do this in their personal lives all the time. We should give them a way to do it in their work lives. The third principle I would say about sort of making change is that if you're not irritating the oyster, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get a pearl. What we really want to do is find ways to irritate appropriately during the discovery process, such that the organization creates something which has a greater degree of flexibility and capacity to support these new kinds of work. The approach is both abstract and straightforward, and this would be the second thing I would ask that you give some thought to as you walk away from this. This relatively simple relationship diagram simply says this, that the trends, which are the things in the left, the T, plus the values that an organization or a society holds clearly, are what together defines the themes of opportunity. So what does this mean? My experience in working on this kind of thing for a long time is that we tend to become infatuated with whatever is exciting to us at the moment, a trend. And we tend to take a relatively thin slice off of that and say, well, gosh, people can work anywhere, so I guess that's what we should do. Or this idea of telepresence is really going to change everything, so we need to rush out today and make certain that all of our laptops and handheld devices are able to support video conferencing. We tend to take a too narrow view of trends, and we don't let them be tempered by the other things that the organization is and does that maybe slow some of that down. And these are oftentimes values. So what might that be? So a value that seems to hold fairly true for most organizations is the pursuit of simplicity. Another value is the pursuit of plurality. Now, these things mean different things in different cultures. So if we said plurality today and we were in Tehran, that might mean one thing that would be quite different from what we might meet if we were in Portland, Oregon. So these words can have different meaning, but the important thing is to think about them. What are the things that buffer or temper the kinds of trend changes? And then to try and think about trends a little more broadly so that we don't end up with following sort of exciting thing du jour off into the weeds. The mechanism for making this happen is, I think, fairly clear and fairly well developed at this point. We know that people learn best when they're engaged experientially. We also know that they will break down the barriers of their self-perception, the barriers of what they've always done, the barriers of what they think is supposed to happen next, best when they're in an experience that causes the insight to develop for them. In other words, rather than being told, when they can discover or come to know, they'll accept a great deal more change. So the engagement in thinking about the future of an organization and what its buildings need to be needs to be more about the organizational future, not the building future, and put into a setting where people can talk about that and begin to think about culture, for example, helps them ready themselves for thinking about places in a different way that actually they would never ask for because they're really only experts on what they've always done. And if we think that the future holds something significantly different, then we need to engage them experientially to uncover or discover what that future looks like during this process so that they can help us push the frontier a little further. The third and fourth point are really Drucker again. It's about recognizing that the metrics that we have in place today, or better yet, the metric system that we need to put in place for our buildings, needs to embrace everything from the traditional questions of real estate utilization and project cost on the left in the efficiency bucket, to the questions on the right about human effectiveness. So if we care about an organization that can innovate, if we care about an organization that collaborates better, if we care about an organization that learns and thinks better, how do we measure those things? And how do we hold our buildings actually accountable for some of that? This is a tricky and difficult thing, but nowhere near as tricky and difficult as sometimes I think we make it feel. There's been a lot of research done in the last 4 or 5 years that helps open this up. In fact, Einstein once said that when you're in a situation of new conditions, the most important thing to do is to learn to measure what matters. It's frequently said in business that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so right now I find what happens is that we say, well, this idea of knowledge and creative work can't really be managed very well, so we're not going to try to measure it. So we end up holding our buildings accountable not for these new behaviors, but for the old paradigm of sort of real estate constraints and location and whatnot. And that's just not an effective way for us to think about our buildings as we lean forward. Buildings are amazing tools for social interaction. If we care about that, let's learn about ways to measure that. That's incidentally a particular area of interest of mine. Two last pieces that really go to the language of design. The first is that we think about the sustaining parts of the environment, and whether this is LEED or whether we think more broadly about how we could design buildings that integrate into communities to create sustainability. Clearly this is important. It's becoming more and more important, not only as a question of fact, but also as a question of perception by your younger employees. And so if we were to step back and say this idea of attraction and retention and development of people is central to our capability to be successful, one of the things that matters to those people is, does my company, does my organization care? And then the last piece, this notion of expression, I find that many times organizations, in their desire to figure out what to do next, do a fair amount of benchmarking with other companies about what they're doing. And that's fine as far as it goes, so long as we remember that what IBM does and what Ford does need to be different because they are different as organizations. And we should not look at someone else's answers as being the answer. We should look at them more as indicators of a directional change and then ask the question, what does that mean to us? So those are sort of the high-level principles. To do this, as I said, we really need a measurement system. We talked a little bit about the efficiency-based metrics a moment ago. And finally, we've begun to talk about how to measure the more complicated things like individual and group work. We've talked a little bit about the impact of the lacing together, the braiding of the technologic or virtual world and the physical, and how those two need to be thought of as one tool in support of work effectiveness. And finally, we've talked a little bit about these higher order things that are actually what keep most of the C-suite awake at night. How do we create effective organizations? Now, it is the case that some of these things are quantitative and quite easy to count, and we know how to count them, and we count them regularly, and others are much more qualitative, more difficult to count, more abstract. This has always been the case. This is the classic debate between natural science and social science, for example. But the stuff on the right is actually geometrically more important to the legacy of the organization than is the stuff on the left. And so building an organization and helping our own C-suite see the value of the present value of that organization through the lens of buildings helps us move in a direction where we can create a measurement system that actually works. So in close, one final slide, and then we'll see if you have any questions. In the end, humans care about place. They always have. Someday we'll uncover the chromosome or the gene even that expresses that, I suspect. It's down in us deep. We think about our homes as important. We think about our offices as necessary evils where, you know, nothing really has evolved. In fact, everything has evolved. In fact, people spend many times, in many cases, more time at work than they spend in their homes. And yet we think of our offices as kind of shallow, uninteresting. So I think the first thing is to invert that and let place matter again to humans, recognizing, second, that it's seldom neutral. It's either holding us back to what we've been and done, or it's leveraging us forward to some sort of a new set of behaviors and future-oriented attitudes. That's really where we want to get. The biggest value that buildings bring is not in being less bad. The biggest value is in helping people be better. So how do we learn how to measure that? And that's that whole discussion again. And then lastly, I'd say that as we invest in social networks online, that is exactly the same discussion we need to have about the social networks that we have face-to-face. It's clear that people can and do form relationships and sustain relationships both ways. The game, I think, for the future of buildings, when we answer this question about why we have them at all, is to answer it in the context of the creation of the most possible value from the activity of humans that delivers not only financial value, but delivers life satisfaction to the people who inhabit our organizations. I thank you all for taking the time to listen, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take a shot at them now. I'd also be happy to stay in touch with you if you're interested over time, and perhaps we can continue the dialogue. So let's see if there are any questions. Doug?
And Dave, we do have some questions. You're asking some of the most, or provoking some thought around the most basic ideas here. Starting kind of at the bottom here, you talked an awful lot about getting people to think about how they work, where they work, doing that experiential change. With people who have been in the workplace for decades, how do you get people to break out of their long-standing mindsets, such as I go to an office every day and I have a desk somewhere and that is where I do my work? What do you do to provoke people into thinking differently and doing that creativity it looks like you're pointing to that pushes them in the right direction?
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts on that. It's a good question. The first is to remember that the reason people think about it the way they think about it. Those persons you were describing, whether they're brand new to the workforce or 30 years in the workforce and angling for retirement. The reason we all think about place the way we do is some combination of what's intrinsic to us as people. And I make the argument that place matters to people in a fundamental way, but it's also what they've been taught. So we have taught people organizationally that space matters in certain ways. We need to, my wife is a veterinarian, and she recently had to change one of our cats over to a new kind of food because the cat developed a disease that could be treated with better diet or a different diet. Well, the cat really had no interest in the new diet at all. And I think that's similar to where we are with people. We've sort of taught them what to eat. We've taught them what this means. We've taught them what buildings are for, what they're supposed to get at different points, etc. This is sort of a behavioral norm that we've hammered in for a long time. And so my only point in that is that we need to recognize that different people will change at different rates. Different people's need for different things is real. Some people need more space to concentrate, more time to concentrate. Others can do very well in a highly dynamic setting. A lot of this goes back to the premise of you work how you learned how to learn. And so if you learned in a multimodal world where you're answering texts while you're playing an online game, while you're researching your English paper, that's one way of working that actually is quite conducive to being in a very dynamic workplace. For others, it wasn't that way, and more concentration is required. For others, it was, I'm going to retreat to the library and concentrate, and that's the way I learned to learn. So we have to recognize that this change first will come slowly. We've taught them, after all, what they now believe to be right. The second thing is that if we ask them, they will tell us what they've always done as opposed to what they need to do next. And so one of the mistakes in this, to me, is that we assume that it's the senior people in the organization in terms of duration and age who are the most resistant. Sometimes that's true, and some of them are very resistant. On the other hand, I would say that a great number of people who are facing retirement in the next 5 years, the baby boomers in particular now, realize that they have a lot left to give and a lot to transfer out of their hearts and their heads before they leave, and they're looking for ways to forge different kinds of relationships. So I would encourage people to engage your workforce in the possibility of what the future holds for their organization, and to start there at the work level, not at the building level, and let the building be an outcome of that, and then expect that people can and will change, not all at the same rate and pace, but that change is something which can be induced through the understanding that this isn't about you, this is about this thing you've contributed so much to before you leave, and making that sort of lasting impact by transferring your knowledge.
Terrific. Going along those exact same lines, one of the biggest projects that we're involved with is the change at the GSA headquarters, and what they are implementing is actually several different answers. They definitely have different constituents where they care about different things. Just as you're saying, whether it's a generational thing or not, some folks are, I want my traditional workplace. Others are more interested in collaboration, close collaboration. Others are more interested in working pretty much so from anywhere. So are you saying that a likely path forward is not one particular answer, but perhaps a combination of perspectives on workplace and where work occurs and how people interact?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the killer app, if we were to step back to tech language for a second, the killer app in space is actually choice. What I want is what I need based on who I am and what I'm doing. And what I need may not just be the tasks, it's my personality. And if we were able to acknowledge that and say to people, hey, you have still this place that is your place, if you want that. And by the way, the rest of the campus is your place too, or the rest of the building, or the rest of the floor, or the rest of our office, or whatever. And you can work wherever you want to work. If we were able to offer people a range of choices, and the freedom and control to do that, if we had those kinds of systems in our organizations, if in fact the way we thought about place paralleled the way we're increasingly thinking about work, which is exactly like that. Do what you need to do to get it done. I didn't hire you to manage you. I hired you because you're very knowledgeable. Of course I want to work with you and mentor you and you me, but I actually trust that you can get this done and I need you to do it. So if we think about it that way, then we would give this control quite naturally to people. We would create spaces that are designed to allow as much freedom and choice and control at the individual and group level as we could. And frankly, I think you can do that for a lot less cost than we assume today. I think we've gotten ourselves into a situation where we assume that we have to have this tight-fit standards sort of a mentality where people are allowed or not allowed to have certain things and required to get things as life changes. And actually, that kind of a system can be quite expensive to manage. What would happen if you had a relatively more open system that was designed with plenty of options in it where people could choose what they needed to choose? Now, this all begs the case of, do we have management systems in place to know that our people are actually doing the things they need to do to be productive? And of course, that's a management question. And if we don't have those, then none of this matters. But I would argue that for most sort of knowledge and creative kinds of people, those systems are already in place. Most of us sort of assume that we're going to have monthly or weekly or quarterly reviews with our boss and that we're working on project work over time, that involves a whole lot of complexity that we have to sort of invent as we go along, invent the answers to, etc. So I think this model is actually how work is happening. We just haven't adapted place to it, and if we gave people the same control over place that we expect them to demonstrate over how they get their work done, we'd be in a better spot.
Understood. Interesting. All right, so one of our early questions here is, almost immediately you went from talking about buildings to why we have office space, kind of making a much more specific question. Has any of this thinking been applied to the other kinds of workplaces or maybe even the workspace types?
Well, I'm not sure if are we talking here about, I'm not certain of the exact question. If we're talking about manufacturing spaces, for example, as opposed to office spaces, or if we're talking about home spaces as opposed to office spaces, I'm really not the exact question.
I'm guessing from the question that they're asking more along the lines of kind of a closed-door, single individual office to cubicles, to workbenches, to lounge kind of areas that, progressing across the spectrum of types of physical places to do work.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and I may not have made this clear enough at the beginning. When I reference office, I'm not thinking about a room with a door. I'm thinking about the office space that an organization inhabits, a department, a floor, a person. And so I think what the research is suggesting is more or less what we've been saying, which is that different people need different things at different times to do their best. Sometimes they need the dynamics of stimulation. Sometimes they need to be around other people. Sometimes they need to be alone. Sometimes they need to be staring into a corner looking at their own ideas posted on a wall or written on a marker board. Sometimes they need to work in dyads. Sometimes it's a large group. Sometimes it's, coding where I'm heads down for 2 days and then come back together with the other 9 people who are working. And so I think the answer is the office needs to support all of that. It needs to be designed to support all of that, and most of those things, I would say, are disproportionately we-oriented, not I-oriented. Now, that does not mean that the I work and the need for quiet that goes along with that, the need for focus that goes along with that, is not equally important. It's just that that work can actually be done in a lot of other locations. I could go to, for example, an enclave or a library space in my own building or at a public library. I can stay at home. I can do lots of things to focus. But it's difficult to do things to come into social contact with the other people with whom I need to work, those informal contacts as well as the structured formal ones. So this is that idea of owned spaces at the group level, as well as divergent shared spaces at the group level. So what about work cafes? Cafes that behave more like a Starbucks, but it's all inhabited by your own people, where these kinds of dynamic interactions come to bear. What happens when that place is populated by a range of different kinds of settings that allow people to dip in and out of small group activities, create some focus zone when they need that, etc. So it's really a radical rethink, I suspect, of how all of this kind of work gets solved for. Not so much about the specific office with a door, but in a workplace that's designed around this range of settings.
Understood. And it looks like we got a little bit of clarification there. They were asking around research, technology development, laboratory space, that kind of thing. And it sounds like you're saying that you got to have the room for both. Just with your example of software coders, there's probably specific equipment or resources where you still got to preserve that at a common location that someone would go to for work. But there's plenty of opportunities around that where somebody does work is all dependent on the culture, the kind of collaboration they need, as you're saying.
Well, yes, that is what I'm saying. But if you go down the path of electronics labs or wet labs in the pharma businesses and whatnot, if you go down the medical path, there are all sorts of unique subsets to this. The overarching principles that we're describing really are the same. Where does the I work happen best? Where does the we work happen? It's just that the tools sometimes get way past a marker board when you're in a wet lab. And so how do you create the appropriate environment in which that can happen, which still allows the right balance of individual and social activity to happen. One thing we are seeing, and I'm not an expert on this at all, is that the need for social space inside of wet lab companies, or areas of companies where wet lab activity is going on, is a better way to say it, is increasing radically. And that's typically not something that's been well addressed in the past.
Interesting. Okay, well, we've got a completely different question here. Most of the research and data for the workplace tends to be self-reported and qualitative. It looks like we're still searching for quantitative data on workplace features, what's important and what produces results. I'm always being asked for the quantitative evidence. Can you cite any of that or point us in the right direction for the quantitative side?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where some of the frontier is actually unfolding right around us today. So it's an interesting topic to bring up in light of the NSA, the revelations about NSA tapping into phone records and privacy and all of this stuff. But I think we all realize that as we go about our daily activities, our images of what we're doing are being captured by all sorts of visual sensors all the time. We would traditionally think of them as cameras, but whether they're on stoplights or in buildings, retail, etc., camera imaging is out all over the place. And so that's just an example to me of a much broader question about how sensing can deliver quantitative insight into how people behave. And we can think of this in many different ways, certainly. We can think about this as the intrusion of Big Brother, keeping track of us. We can think about this as overreaching of government or organization wanting to count our every step and wonder why we're in the bathroom so long, some of this really kind of basic stuff. Or we can also look at it the other way and say, well, gosh, if I could better understand how a quality human interaction actually works and what it looks like when it's happening, would I be better positioned to design spaces that actually can be justified from a quantitative point of view in supporting that? And so I point the participants to an article in the Harvard Business Review, I believe it was in April last year. It's written by a guy named Ben Weber, W-A-B-E-R, and I'm trying to get to the title in my head. It's something to the effect of The New Science of Great Teams. And basically what Ben and his team at MIT have done is take the latest in sensing technology as a research tool. Now, we're not talking about doing this for all people all the time as a way of watching them. But suppose that you suppose that in a dialogue you have with another person, we naturally know that our voices vary. And as we become more engaged with each other, our voice tone tends to vary, our voice volume tends to vary, the frequencies of our voices vary, the frequency, the pace of our speech, the way we share airspace with another person. These are all natural things. These are natural sort of outcomes of a collaborative activity happening. And suppose we could actually hear those things, not the content of the dialogue, but could hear the differences in voice tone as people become increasingly engaged, could see if there was good sharing of the airspace. Suppose that we could see, in addition to hearing, if those people together got up and moved over to a marker board or began to look at a shared document on a computer screen. Suppose that we could sense when they were physically more active, because it turns out that physical activity is directly related to intellectual activity. So when we start to move when we're in a collaborative setting, it generally means that good things are going on. So all of these are sort of, if you will, human outputs of interaction quality. And suppose there were a way to measure these things, not as a way of keeping track of whether we're taking a break or not, but as a way of seeing when and where and how high-quality collaboration is happening, for example. Anyway, that's the idea that Ben posits in this article. He has a small firm that's a spin-off out of Media Lab at MIT called Sociometric Solutions. You can go online and look at their website. The promise of this is the ability to see into human behaviors in ways that people cannot self-report. So suppose we could say that here are 5 conference rooms, which one actually works better for what kinds of meetings? Here, 2 of them are open, 1 of them is completely enclosed, one's enclosed with a glass wall, and one is, the entire interior surface is covered with marker board or something. You can make the variables be whatever you want to be, but suppose we could actually understand how those rooms would support different qualities of interaction and in a measurable way show which one was actually better for which kinds of activities. So that's the sort of thing that, to me, leaves us in a spot where we can begin to develop this quantitative information that the person is asking about, and at least start to get to some better rules of thumb. Today, the way spaces tend to be designed is we design them around what we've experienced. We may or may not try something different or new that seems like a new idea, a trend, if you will, but we're oftentimes not the least bit sure if they're actually working the way they're supposed to. Historically, the way we would do this is we would apply the tools of social science. We would use a survey. We would send someone out to watch. We would do bed checks and count how many people are in which rooms. And we would try in a very mechanical way to get data. It's possible now to get data of a much different kind. And again, I think it's absolutely central that people hear this in the context of research and of the preservation of individual privacy. This is not a big brother thing. This is actually trying to understand what might work better. If we think about it, we send these signals. Sandy Pentland, a prof at Media Lab, talks about it this way. These are sort of honest signals that occur between people as they naturally have dialogues. And if we could just learn to understand those signals and count that data in a different way, we'd have a whole new stream of quantitative information that would help us assess the importance and value of place.
It sounds like you're actually extending some of what is already happening, some of what we already support with. We're measuring the effectiveness of the actual office or workplace by detecting whether or not somebody is there and how many folks are using a space and during which period of time. What you're talking about is actually extending that and watching how they interact to measure the event's effectiveness, the collaboration's effectiveness beyond just the real estate or the office space part of it. That's really
that's exactly right. That's where the money is. The money's in the people, and the opportunity is in the people. The space only exists to serve that. Counting occupancy is a terrible surrogate for whether the space is effective. It just tells us how frequently it's being used. It doesn't tell us if there's anything good going on there.
Right. It measures the effectiveness, the physical effectiveness, not the outcome, the performance that you were talking about with effective organizational measurement.
Yeah, more like that, yes.
The next question we have here, what do you see as the impact of the upcoming massive retirement of baby boomers from the workforce?
The biggest impact of the retirement of the boom is the transmission of tacit knowledge before they leave. One of the interesting things, just in quick summary, there's a great book called The Knowledge Creating Company by Ichihiro Nonaka that's well worth the read if you're interested in this stuff. But basically what it says is there are kind of two kinds of information: explicit stuff, which is written down, codified in databases, and tacit stuff, which is held in our heads. The the boom, because of how technology emerged as a record-keeping function, came during an era, had their productive careers in an era, learned their best practices and their wisdom in an era when most everything was held tacitly. The databases were not very good. They were file cabinets, and it just wasn't effective. Today, of course, we have much better explicit information records than we used to, but the biggest challenge in the boom, in the boom's retirement, is to pump the tacit out of them and into other people's brains before they leave. There's a gigantic amount of brain drain we're about to experience as that walks out the door. You can have the most brilliant young MBA student or brilliant young PhD student in whatever, and really, when people walk in the door of organizations, they know a lot less that's useful than some of the more senior people do. It's getting the mind meld between those two groups before the boom leaves that's the big deal, knowledge transfer.
So we've got two more questions here, but just want to get your opinion on this last, extend that last little bit. Do you think that the way we communicate, the way we work more virtually will help to extend the value to the organization of that that tacit knowledge that's going to walk away when the boomers retire? Do you think they're going to leave the office and still participate in the value production of the organization they've left?
Yeah, I do. I think this is really as much a demographic question as anything. The boom is an interesting group in that the millennials are about the same as the baby boom in terms of the degree of intellectual preparation. So they are the most highly educated, those two generations that we've ever produced. Most of these people are going to live for quite a while longer. Forget the economic implications of retirement. Most of them are not ready to let their brains retire. And so I think what we'll see happen is that this sort of contingent workforce, which used to go off into volunteer land or sit on the porch or go bass fishing or something, is going to want to retain some degree of intellectually productive activity for a much longer time. And so that suggests that the virtual connectivity to those people in different ways, the second career, the third career kind of a model, is retirement careers, is exactly what we'll see. And there's no question technology will facilitate that greatly.
That's great. Well, we've got two more questions here, if you don't mind staying around with us. The first one is, you said that people work the way they've been taught. Most people are not taught so much on collaboration, but more on competition, no matter what's kind of said on the surface. Do you think this is going to create challenges as we move towards the optimization of the business development in the current environment?
Yeah, I do. This is a really great question. So I'm going to take it down a slightly different path in answering. If you step back to what I was saying earlier about organizational design, the designs of organizations that we have today are largely masculine. And one of the characteristics of masculinity is competitiveness. And I don't mean male and female. I don't mean gender-specific roles in our society. I'm thinking if you go back to the basics, go back to Gerd Hofstede and look, who's a social psychologist, and look at the key defining axes of culture. One of them is masculinity to femininity. And again, it's not about men and women. It's about the characteristics that we attribute to being feminine and the characteristics that we attribute to being masculine. Organizations, as we understand them today, are built on a masculine model of competitiveness. Organizations, like schools, train our kids to be that way. On the other hand, if you look at what business organizations are asking their people to do today, it's much more behave in a collegial manner, respect other people who have different perspectives than you do. You may be the best darn engineer on the block, but you're not going to get the product to market without a good marketing person, a good design person, a good business model person, etc. So it's learn to play well with others, be co-creative, etc. These are all characteristics largely of the feminine approach. And so what we're seeing happen, I believe, is a shifting of the weight gradually to a more balanced view. If the organization has been historically very masculine, built on the military and the church model, what we're seeing is that the behaviors which we would call more feminine are becoming the behaviors that organizations need to be successful. That suggests that this whole idea of competition versus collaboration is going to shift fairly radically. We are still training people more or less today around the assumptions of competitiveness, and we still assess and measure, and I don't think that's likely to change a lot, but it could also be the case that we start to think more about how we teach better in teams. So, for example, some of the best business schools today are the ones that teach their students in teams. Some of the best business thinking today is to teach people to utilize both hemispheres of their brain, the design thinking idea, not just the left brain analytical. So if we start to see these kinds of patterns expressing themselves because this is what it takes to be successful as a business, then I think we'll see a gradual shifting in the direction of greater collaboration. And that will happen at the educational level and on into our organizations. But these are longer wave changes. Right now, the hot ticket is somebody who can do both. Somebody who can play in this more collaborative and competitive world, but who doesn't compete internally, but views the building of the internal team, the win-win, which is, again, a feminine characteristic, as being something that's the goal, not competing against your own team members for recognition internally.
Terrific answer. Our final question here, how do you help people see that there are different forms of status and that hierarchical status is only one of them?
Yeah, that's another really good one. This is a very difficult problem, and it's primarily difficult because, again, it's so self-reinforced throughout all of our culture. I don't know that I necessarily can address this as unique in the workplace, except to say in this way, that when the executive management group, the leadership team, chooses to affect itself in the same way that it is affecting everyone else. And I don't mean that everybody is equal or anything like that. I mean, that's a different kind of a thing. But if we can get to an organizational model where what the boss says is good for everybody else but not for her, then we're in a spot where at least organizations are sending the message to people that something is different here now. We're not about status and rank anymore. We're trying to be more about this collegial collaborative model, and we're living that too. That helps send that message in a way that, in my experience, most C-suite executives have never thought of. It doesn't dawn on them that the way they choose to accommodate themselves actually is sending a message to the rest of the organization that says we're still about status and rank. And if they care about changing that and getting people more engaged, then what they need to do is allow themselves to be affected. And I've found many are very willing to hear this. They just haven't thought about it. And they haven't thought about it mostly through the organizational lens. They've thought about it from a physical building lens, and that's a harder sell. Take them to what they care about. What they really care about is building a successful organization, because that's what they get rewarded for. If you help them see that, and that this sends a message that's the opposite of that, many of them were quite willing to consider alternatives.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that particular pattern expressed across the successful the organizations where they've done some kind of significant workplace change and been successful. That the leadership is not just talked about the change and the need for it, but actually participated in it, in visible ways to everyone. I think that's an excellent point. We've got a couple more questions here, but I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Dave, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, great ideas, taking everybody's questions and answers here. I will go back through the recording and look at the kind of examples, and you cited a couple of books or papers, I believe. We'll get those out to everybody who is interested in reading them. We want to thank everybody for attending today, especially Steelcase and David for being with us, and everybody please watch your email inboxes for next month's webinar. And thanks everybody from all of us here at AgilQuest and Dave from Steelcase. Good afternoon.